Welcome to Shelter in Solidarity, a deep dive with activists, artists, and experts in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm your guest, Joe Ramsey, broadcasting here from Dorchester, Massachusetts, well into our second week of this forced shelter in place. Our show topic today is breaking down the bailout, and we have two terrific guests who will be joining us shortly to offer their expert perspective about what this recent so-called bailout, this federal relief package, the COVID crisis package entails, what it means, what people need to know about it, what's in it, what's not, and what it means for organizers and those who are seeking to support people in solidarity in this moment. Before we get to that, I should also point out, we'll be joined later in the broadcast with a report from frontline worker struggles happening across the country. We hope to have Barbara Madeloni, longtime president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association and current editor of Labor Notes, with us, joining us later to talk about some of what's going on. I mean, the situation in this country and around the world is an acute crisis right now. I was just looking over the headlines a moment ago. I'm sure many of you are familiar. We've had 2,400 deaths in just the United States in the last 24 hours, bringing the total US death count from COVID to close to 35,000. That brings the total world count to close to 150,000 deaths already. 2 million people reported to have the disease already. And this health crisis has quickly become an economic crisis. Recent news say that 5 million people filed for unemployment this week alone in the United States, bringing the total of the past month to 22 million newly unemployed people. Many of these highlights may be and lowlights may be familiar to you already, but our hope today is to get beyond the headlines, to get deeper into this bailout, what it means, not only for us as individuals struggling to survive in this moment, but as activists and organizers who are seeking to seize the opportunities as well as confront the dangers of this moment to make a better world come out of this crisis than we went into this crisis with. The first guest I'd like to bring in is Doug Henwood. He's an author, a pundit, a Facebook persona, a radio host himself with Behind the News on the KPFK network, as well as a blogger and an analyst who posts at Left Business Observer. Doug, we're really happy to have you with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
How are things where you are?
Well, I'm here in Brooklyn, New York. The sirens have died down. For a while, we heard sirens all the time. The sirens are now only a few a day, so I don't know what that means. We also live under the flight path to LaGuardia Airport, and it used to be a plane every minute or two, and now just a few a day. So just the sounds really are a marker of how things have changed here. And I've been out very little. I've been sort of sealed in the apartment for a little over 5 weeks. Go out for a walk now and then, but it's a weird way to live, especially in a big city where we're used to crowds, and people who like big cities like crowds, and it's really very frustrating to be so socially isolated.
Absolutely. Our second guest today will be Matt Stoller. Matt is also an author of the recent book Goliath, which tracks the conflict between democracy and monopoly over the last 100 years. Matt is also a director and a voice with the American Economic Liberties Project. And Matt, before we opened up for questions, I just want to check in. First off, say it's really great for you to join us on such short notice today. And how are you doing? I understand you're in DC.
I'm good. A little stir crazy, but very fortunate. And I get to write and study things, and I can do that at home. So I feel very lucky amidst, a lot of people are not doing well. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, as the title of our show implies, right? Shelter in solidarity. Of course, it's important to remember not everyone even has the luxury of sheltering in place, of social distancing in this moment. Some of us do. And for those who do, we hope the show can be a tool not only to get people through this period, keeping their sanity and their spirit intact, but also giving them concrete things they can do to contribute to the struggles of other people around the world and in this country. Doug, let's start with you, just to keep things a little organized here. We'll go to you first, but I mean, Matt, I'll be pitching you similar questions in a moment. Doug, what do you think everyone needs to know about this recent bailout package? in particular things that they might not already have heard through the headlines. What is your read on what this recent so-called bailout package represents? And what do you see as the problems, or if there are any virtues in it? What's your kind of read, your balance sheet on it, and what it means?
Well, there's several components to it. One, of course, is what the Federal Reserve is doing, which is pumping trillions of dollars. I've lost count of how many trillions into the financial system. Now, I can understand wanting to keep the financial system from completely imploding. If it imploded completely, we'd be in even worse trouble than we are right now. But their aim is basically to restore the status quo ante, and that is not something I think is a very good idea. We should have a different kind of financial system when we come out of this than when we went into it. Then, of course, there's what Congress passed, the $2 trillion rescue package, which has some good things in it, but has a lot of bad things in it. The aid to people, the increased unemployment insurance, $600 a week, additional benefits, wider coverage for people who previously weren't eligible for unemployment insurance. These are good things. The $1,200 check, if they ever arrive, this is a good thing, but very meager. So that portion of it is certainly better than nothing, but far short of what other countries are doing, which are providing much more aggressive income supports to people who get unemployed. But then a whole bunch of the package is aid to big business. The president has a $500 billion slush fund with apparently no oversight. And the assistance to small business is already out of money, but the whole thing is very poorly administered and very poorly conceived. So that is, there's a little bit of good stuff in there, but a lot of not so good stuff and some actively bad stuff. We don't need, all this aid to the airline industry, to Boeing. These are companies that had spent fortunes buying back their own stock, and now they're broke. That kind of financial recklessness characterized a lot of American business over the last decade or so. And now here they are facing this massive crisis with very little in the way of resources. But I would want to emphasize that this is not like a conventional recession of the sort you learned about in Econ 101. It's not like the previous financial crisis, which originated in the financial sector. This is with the real world. This is like labor. People can't go to work. Supply chains are broken. Things are shut down. There are going to be a whole bunch of small businesses that won't be able to reopen when this is all over. So there's people, the IMF, other people like that are expecting JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they're all expecting something of a pretty rapid bounce back later in the year. I really don't see that happening. But I would say longer term, what we really need to do, instead of just pumping all this money out, is really address the physical infrastructure of the country, which is falling apart. We need a Green New Deal, and at both parts of that, the green part and the New Deal part. We need to rebuild the infrastructure, find some way to live within the means of our climate around us, and just reconfigure the physical and social way we live. I mean, we can see this crisis is really bringing out the intense class and racial and geographical fissures in this country. We really need to address those. The incredibly poor allocation of health resources, not just health insurance, but where hospitals are, the kinds of resources that are available to different communities. It's just the screaming inequality of it is just a scandal. And we really need to address that if we want to emerge from this a better country. Now, there is a chance we could have a different ethic of solidarity and a certain longer term understanding of how we should approach things. Certainly that's not going to happen with the current leadership. It's hard to imagine a Biden administration even rising to the level of an FDR sense of how to restructure things over the long term. But funnier things have happened, I suppose. But there is this. I hope that we could think about this and have a serious rethink of the way our political economy is organized, because as climate change gets worse, there's going to be more of this sort of thing, not less.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, I mean, I noticed in some of your public writings on the crisis, you have talked about this element, the element of opportunity in the current situation, right? And one note I saw that was prominent in some of your LBO writings was on the idea that not every industry should be brought back, right? That we're in this moment when many industries have been collapsing, and to some degree, it's not the way in which we chose to get to the issue of like how should we plan our economy. We didn't ask for a virus to bring us there, but in some sense, we've been brought to this position where the economy is so overtly politicized, right? I mean, could you say a little more about that, about how this moment may in fact create opportunities to address some of these concerns about which industries should be brought back and which ones should not. I know you mentioned the airplane industry, one of the notorious polluters, as well as, of course, one of the great conduits for the virus itself. We'll wrap that.
I mentioned at the top that I live under this flight path to LaGuardia Airport, and like every minute or two, in normal times, an airplane goes. We just fly too much. We have to fly a lot less. The airline industry needs to be restructured on a much smaller scale, and we really have to think about where it should be in the longer term, because it is one of the most filthy things you can imagine. The president wants to bail out the cruise ship industry, which is an environmental crime of the highest order. They're just filthy ships, not just spewing carbon, but they burn a really dirty diesel fuel too. So it's just it's a crime. It shouldn't exist. The president wants to bail out the fracking industry, and they may be using public funds from the bailout to restructure the fracking industry. That's something that should go too. It'd be a great time with the oil price this low. It'd be pretty easy to nationalize the oil sector and basically put it out of business soon. It's one way or the other. Replace private transportation with public transportation, high-speed rail. I remember back in the financial crisis 10 years ago, China built 10,000 miles of high-speed rail. We were still trying to debate building a little one in Ohio, I believe. It was just, that kind of thing. But also our state capacity is so eroded. All these decades of neoliberalism have left our political class really incapable of thinking or governing in any meaningful way. So to watch the hapless way that people at every level of government, from the idiotic president on down, have botched this thing. My mayor in New York, my governor, who is now a hero, but both these people drag their feet terribly in shutting down the city and the state. We have people, governors in the South who are not shutting it down. We have the Pennsylvania state legislature trying to override the governor's shutdown. We have just really, really kind of sick and incompetent political culture that we need to think about. The CDC used to be one of the great institutions in the world, and now it looks very eroded. Nothing seems to work very well in this country. We really need to think about all that too. And then, the financial system. I mentioned at the beginning that the Federal Reserve is pumping trillions of dollars in, money that it basically creates out of thin air, to restore the status quo ante. No, we need to have a different kind of financial system, one that is basically a utility that serves basic functions, but doesn't really get wild and speculative. So, we do have this opportunity, since everything right now is dependent on government largesse. We're not going to come out of this without some kind of active state. So let's get something out of it instead of just trying to go back to the way of doing things the way we did before it.
Yeah, well said. I think that note about the bankruptcy of the political class perhaps would be an appropriate moment to bring Matt Stoller into the conversation. Matt, you've written extensively not only of the problems with the bailout, but the problems with the political establishment, Democrat and Republican, that has allowed such a bailout to go through with virtually no votes against, right? So I invite you to comment on the bailout, to add to, or to join Doug's analysis, but also pick up this specific question of what do you think is being revealed about the political class and the politics of this country in this moment?
I think it seems fine to me.
Best of all possible worlds.
It's all fun. Yeah, whatever. It's all good.
Right.
Yeah. So a really hacky thing to do is to cite like a weird old philosopher who's somewhat obscure to justify what you think. So I'm going to do that. So there's this philosopher named Richard Cantillon, who was basically a private equity guy in the 18th century. And then he wrote a book, one of the first books about economics. And he named something something in that book was named the Cantillon effect, which is basically when a nation discovers gold, what happens economically, right? And what he found, or what he described, is when a nation discovers gold, the people who get access to that gold, first of all, are people that are closest to the king, right? People that are closest to the mine owners. And then the gold goes out and has all sorts of consequences eventually the gold finds its way, the money finds its way to the rest of the economy. but the people closest to the king get it first. And so in that time lag between when they get the gold and everybody else gets the gold, because, you know, they eventually buy things like meat pies and hire servants and whatnot, they have an opportunity to acquire more assets and acquire more power. There's a lot of there's also a lot of trade consequences as well, but it's sort of an interesting observation. And it's basically one about institutions, right? Because what he was saying in the 18th century is, you know, if you're close to the king and the king is the most important institution, then you're going to get the benefit of an increase in the money supply. Now, today, the king would be the Federal Reserve, right? But also the other institutions that deploy money in our culture. Now, if you look at the CARES Act, which is the bailout, which you could say is somewhere between $2 trillion and $10 trillion of money and credit, but who's counting, whatever. The people that get it first are the people that are closest to the Federal Reserve. And the reason for that is in many ways because of the same thing that happened in the 18th century, which is that it's just as a practical matter, there's just no way to get money out to ordinary people or to small businesses particularly quickly. We don't have the institutions to do it. The government has really, as Doug said, has been hollowed out. But, you know, the institutions that do still work are the things like the Federal Reserve's relationships with Wall Street banks, or its relationships with private equity, or its ability to trade in sort of obscure but important capital markets. All that stuff works fine. The Fed can do a lot of things there. But if you want to get a check to somebody out there who doesn't have a bank account, that takes 6 months. Or if you want to get a bunch of money out to small businesses, well, the Small Business Administration has kind of been a backwater for 30, 40 years. And all that stuff that gets to normal people, to people without power, that's been hollowed out. It doesn't, you know, so as a result, Congress passed this bill and had money for hospitals, it had money for cities and states, it had money for ordinary people, it had money for the unemployed, a bunch of money for big business, had money for Wall Street. Well, so Congress kind of wanted to deliver money to everybody because there's this really big shock to the economy, which is sort of the right thing to do. I mean, I'll quibble with some very important parts of it. But even though they wanted to get the money out, in fact, because the institutions have been hollowed out because by like decades of sort of bad policy, the money gets out to people with power first. And so it's the private equity industry and Wall Street that are able to get their hands on capital, and everybody else is in a sort of distressed position. And so you're seeing a real reorientation of power upward because of the Cantillon effect. Now, to give you a sense of what private equity industry is, private equity are basically, another way to put it is merchant bankers. They're people that take money, they borrow money, they buy companies. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Goodfellas, but there was a scene in Goodfellas where the guys take a piece of ownership over a restaurant, and they run up the credit of the restaurant to buy liquor, and then they take that liquor out the back and sell it for half off. And then eventually they burn down the restaurant for the insurance money. So what they do is they take an asset and they just loot it, right? And what they're really doing is they're stealing from creditors. So in many ways, that's kind of what private equity does. So private equity will buy a company like this private equity firm called Sycamore Partners. They bought Staples, the big, office supply store. And they immediately borrowed a bunch of money that Staples borrowed, issued a bunch of debt, and then they paid themselves. They had Staples pay themselves $1 billion. And then they had Staples give Sycamore the Staples headquarters. And then Staples signed a 10-year, deal with Sycamore to just rent the headquarters. So what they were basically doing is they were transferring money from lenders to Staples to themselves, right? It was kind of like the Goodfellas. That's called a bust out. That's what private equity is. That's why things are so corroded. That's why, as Doug pointed out, increasingly things don't work. It's because the people in charge of our corporate world, and private equity has about $6 trillion of assets under management, which is about a fifth of the total amount of our whole stock market capitalization. They keep ruining these companies. They also control a lot of our politics, so they keep ruining our institutions. So stuff doesn't work. That's what eventually happens. Like when you put arsonists in charge of your society, eventually, you burn all the restaurants down. And so what we're seeing, even if Congress wanted to act, oh, and by the way, Jay Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, He actually comes from private equity. He comes out of the Carlyle Group. So don't worry, that's taken care of. So anyway, so the point here is that this debate that happened before the bailouts, and I was paying attention to coronavirus back in February and in January, and then I was like, oh, so I worked in Congress during the financial crisis. So as the debates were starting over, who to give money to, I was like, hey, this seems like a bad idea what they're doing, and tried to organize progressive groups to sort of structure the bailouts differently, and I got like very little interest from the left on what to do, because there was sort of this, oh, this stuff is too complicated. I don't understand. I want to kind of retreat to more comfortable things. And as a result, even the top kind of the most important politicians on the Democratic left side, sort of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, whoever you want to point to, they were working with Chuck Schumer to pass this bailout, which passed in the Senate 96-0. The House didn't even do a roll call vote. And there were a few people on the right who voted against it. AOC voted against it, but it was pretty much unanimous. And what I saw was a kind of entire system failure on the left and on the progressive side. People that just kind of were just too frightened to really learn and pay attention to corporate power, and really just kind of wanting somebody else to take care of it. And it was very disillusioning to watch that debate play out. And now, I'm sitting here explaining why, there's yet another kind of catastrophe. And Doug knows this. This is the Michael Milken model for how to finance things. We saw this in the 80s with junk bonds and savings and loans. We saw this in the 90s with the bailout of banks through Mexico, long-term capital management. We saw the financial crisis, which I'm sure you guys all know very well, in 2008, 2009. And, we're seeing it again. And in many cases, it's the same people doing it. So Robert Rubin was involved in the Clinton's bailouts in the 1990s. He was involved with Milken and the mergers and stuff in the 1980s. And that's the whole private equity industry comes from that. He was involved in the 2008 crisis. He was an advisor to Obama. And Robert Rubin was advising the Democratic House members when they were negotiating with Trump over this bailout. So we have the same people doing the same things, continuing to engage in arson, and you have the same culture on the Democratic progressive side of just people being like, what happened? What is that? What? I don't understand. And I just am kind of like, I'm like, all right, well, we're just going to go through this again until someone somewhere actually notices that this stuff is bad and that it's preventable, and we should prevent it. So that's kind of where I am. I'm just kind of like looking at this, and I think it's all like, I mean, it's like, it's not funny, haha, but it is kind of funny. So I don't know what to, I know that's like a little bit cynical, but that's kind of where I am. I'm just like,
right.
Well, people don't seem to care. They don't want to be free.
I invited you to the show after hearing you make some of these points on the Useful Idiots podcast and on Democracy Now, Matt. And we're really hoping that from today's discussion, you can arm and help to tool up some of the activists and organizers who are on this call and who may be watching this broadcast afterwards, with ideas and nuts and bolts understanding of some of these financial mechanisms that could actually be taken up at the level of organizing that many of us are engaged with. I wanted to ask you, and we will bring in Barbara Madeloni momentarily. So glad to have you back, Barbara, on your phone. Can I hear your voice just to make sure you're with us?
Yeah, I think you can hear me, right?
Okay, great. You can hear, great. So we'll come to you in just a moment, but I'll give Matt one more question for now. Matt, you wrote a couple of pieces recently that focus on private equity. One is actually called something along the lines of "Should private equity even exist?" which seems to be an argument that it shouldn't, or that at least in large part it should be abolished. I wondered if you would uphold that as a demand that you think people should be taking up, whether within the context of work organizations or public politics more generally. I'm curious, would there be a problem with doing that? From the standpoint of workers, communities, small businesses, or is private equity, as you have painted, essentially, in large part, an essentially parasitic, gangster-like force that really should be and could be targeted in the way that some of your writings suggest? I also would ask you if you could talk a little more about how these private equity interventions and profiteering, or gangsterism, as you've described it through Goodfellas, connects with the current COVID fight back. Your other piece that you came out a couple days or weeks ago focused on literally profiteering that's happening right now in the medical industry as private equity firms, right, are intervening to actually, I believe, cut medical staff in some of these hospitals, right? Even as, of course, the need is just blooming. So can you talk a little more about how you see the private equity economics and politics intersecting with the conditions of workers, and how we might politicize what you're saying about private equity within progressive politics, assuming we do want to be serious?
Yeah, I mean, the key is to be curious about business and commerce, because business and commerce is what is an important way that we structure social justice in America. And so you have to learn about banking, you have to learn about commerce, you have to learn about market structure if you want to be a participant in conversations about justice. That's just the way it is. And workers and work is a form of commerce. I mean, it is production. That's our, we're a nation of tradespeople. So the problem with private equity is just a shorthand for a way of financing business. Just to give you the philosophical problem, private equity is, the problem is that it's ownership, it's control without responsibility. That's the basic problem with the way that we're running our economy in general. Private equity is a fund. The legal structure, you have a group of guys who get a bunch of money from a pension fund, and then they take that money and they buy companies, which they put in their portfolio, like a mutual fund. You'd buy some shares of stock, except the companies they buy entire companies, not just a few shares, and then they run those companies. But the thing is that because of the legal arrangements, the legal structure of the business, if that company goes bankrupt, they don't have to pay for it. Only the company itself goes bankrupt, and they can the debt, is attached to that company. It's not attached to the private equity partners themselves. So they don't have any responsibility if they screw a bunch of stuff up. So it kind of insulates them from having responsibility for the companies that they buy. They also, there's a lot of sleazy ways that they are able to borrow money. Often what they do is they will there will be an agent that's in charge of a bunch of money that they want to borrow. And so that agent is not necessarily representing the people whose money it is particularly well. This was the case with junk bonds in the 1980s. It was the case with savings and loan. There's a sort of self-dealing aspect to it where if I have a bunch of money to lend and I don't care if it, and somebody bribes me to lend the money and it's not my money, I don't care if I get paid back, I'll take the bribe. And there's a lot of ways that the private equity industry has a lot of collusion. And so they're borrowing money that's not their money, it's pension fund money, and often sort of moving it to their pocket. But and there's a lot of legal arrangements that, we enabled this by changes in antitrust law. We enabled it by changes in banking law. We've enabled it by a series of changes in in bankruptcy law, a whole bunch of pieces in our economy, and we can fix all that. There's a bailout. I think it's called the Stop Wall Street Looting Act by a bunch of by Tammy Baldwin and Sherrod Brown and various others. But the basic idea is you have to stop these guys from doing what they're doing. You have to repair these you have to marry control with responsibility. And fundamentally, the bailouts made the problem worse because one of the big problem with private equity that they're having, the guys themselves, is that they have a lot of debt because the whole industry is based on borrowing money so that you can buy these companies and loot them. Well, now all of a sudden, what do you do when there's a crisis like this? Well, another way of talking about debt is to say you have less and less margin of safety, right? Because if you don't get revenue and you can't service your debt. So now all of a sudden there's a crisis. And what happens? The Federal Reserve comes in and starts buying junk bonds, which are the mechanism by which these guys fund some of their takeovers. Now, I don't think it's going to fix it. I think this problem is too big for just a debt rollover to take care of it. But that's the basic problem: is these guys have control without responsibility, and then the financial system, the Fed, and then Congress has on all sides has enabled them to continue this, I think, what is a very dangerous predatory business model that's destroying our capacity to make things that we need.
Thank you, Matt. I'd like on that issue of control, right? And who has control and how control might be seized back from some of these people who are doing so much predatory damage. I'd like to bring in Barbara Madeloni. Barbara is actually the special co-host of this episode. We had some technical issues, so she's joining us as more of a respondent. In a moment, after Barbara has a chance to speak, I also want to let Matt and Doug know. I'd like to hear from Barbara, Doug, and Matt about what you think a true, for lack of a better term, people's bailout would in fact look like, right? And how that differs from what has been done and how that might look going forward. But Barbara, before we go back to Washington and the issue of how the state and federal government can relate to this crisis from above, if you will, I would like to go to you for a report and a reflection on what you're seeing and hearing about and participating in terms of the struggle on the ground, workers, communities caught up in this COVID-related struggle, the economic aspect, the public health aspect. I know you're in touch with a lot of things that are going on around the country, not only in education. Barbara, for those who don't know, is a former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association here, actually my home union. As well as a current editor at Labor Notes, where many of these stories of workers on the front line are being told. And we'll link to many of those pieces from our Shelter in Solidarity Facebook page. Barbara, could you give us a report on first off, how you're doing, how you're weathering this crisis, and what you're hearing about and what you think is your read on the state of the struggle, what people are demanding from the bottom up, and what's your read on that situation right now?
Thanks, Joe. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm on Zoom all day. I don't know why it decided not to work right then. I guess I want to actually start. And Matt, I imagine you said this flippantly, but you said, as you were describing sort of the decisions that were made relative to the bailout, people don't want to be free. And I want to actually, no matter how flippantly you may have meant that, like I didn't hear you actually talk about people when you were describing what went down. You were talking about politicians who were making decisions, really, I would say, absent thinking about the kinds of questions that Joe just asked me, what's actually happening for working people in this country. And another sort of related thought to that, certainly private equity and financialization has really corrupted our capacity to produce what we need, both in terms of healthcare and goods and services. But the other thing that this crisis is really revealing is this sort of struggle with the word essential worker. And actually, you can even take the word essential out and understand how much it is workers who produce our economy, who produce wealth. So, what we're seeing in terms of the bailout is not so much a reorientation, but I think an exposure through the pandemic and the crisis that it's created and the very concrete ways that workers are now experiencing their lives, whether they are essential workers who are being denied safety and well-being, PPEs, whether they are non-essential workers who are being told that they have to work, and their choice that they're being given is either to work at a non-essential job and get paid or risk their life or not get paid by staying home. And then workers who, like educators in particular, which industry I'm really close to, public education, who are really sort of experiencing in the ways that the work life is intruding in their personal lives, the degree to which they've not had autonomy at work. And what I see happening from the Nurses Network that organized a day of action yesterday across the country, grassroots organizing, some unions supported it, but it really came from nurses who've been on the phone with each other on a regular basis saying we have to do something about personal protective equipment. We have to connect that to nationalizing the hospitals, is that we had demonstrations by nurses supported by the communities across the country yesterday, fighting for those. We've seen, in Detroit, an auto plant shut down for 3 days before the governor locked out and shut down Michigan, because they said, we're not essential workers, we're not going in there if it's not safe. So they made that decision, and then the governor shut the plant down. We see GE workers here in Lynn, Massachusetts, who are walking out around health and safety issues, and also then walking out to say we need to be transforming these GE plants out in the Midwest that are not working, and be building ventilators. So what we're actually seeing is, I don't know that we can call it anything like a movement yet, but we're seeing workers come up against, in a very stark way, the realities of how capital works. And in doing that, beginning to experience the actual power they have, because they are essential to producing the economy and to producing wealth. So to that degree, we have an opportunity, and it's up to us, I think, as organizers to be supporting these grassroots movements, and then helping people within that context to actually name what's happening, experience their power, and knit together the fabric of a movement. We're going to be here for a long time. We're going to be here for a long time because of the virus, and we're going to be here for a long time because of the economic devastation that's been wrought by this. We have both a sense of urgency, but I also think we have time, and it's time that the power is going to be in the workers organizing themselves, and we're beginning to see that.
Thank you, Barbara. So picking up from Barbara's comment about the power that workers have, I'd like to kind of include all three of you with this next question, which is, what do you think people should be demanding right now, or what could be demanded in this moment that would really move us towards taking advantage of the opportunities that Barbara is talking about? I mean, so for Matt, I mean, I would love to hear what you would say. How could the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the federal government, the financial policy be restructured so that it would not be reinforcing these parasitic, destructive private equity trends, but in fact would lead to more investment in Main Street, in the productive economy, in healthcare? Doug, you've already mentioned the possibility of pushing for a Green New Deal in this moment. I wonder if you could elaborate a little further concretely. And I'm not exactly saying you should give advice to workers what demands they should have, but I mean, how can we kind of bring this kind of top-down analysis of the bailout into conversation with the workers' struggles? What do you think a just people's bailout would look like, or what should the next bailout look like if there's going to be another package coming down the pike, one that would serve the needs of workers and organizers that are working with those workers on the front lines, both in the medical care field, but also more broadly, all the people that help to make our society run. So Barbara, I'll pitch it to you first. I mean, what do you think are the demands that are coming up that have the potential to catalyze a kind of national movement beyond these kind of immediate local struggles? And then we'll go to Matt and Doug, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
Yeah, well, I want to frame the question just a little bit, and that is that I think one of the things that I find most exciting about this moment, and I've been in contact with workers who are considered essential workers, non-essential workers who are working, non-essential workers who are not working or maybe working from home, is I think the opening that we see is for workers to really have a deep sense that they are the ones who need to determine what's happening at the work site. Like the possibilities of workplace democracy become very real for people, and it's in immediate ways. Like nurses saying in Chicago, saying, we're going to the break room, we're not going to the ER until you get us masks. We're just not going. And sort of recognizing we get to decide what safety looks like for ourselves. And I think it's important, and certainly the nature of this conversation, to talk about what broader demands would be. but I don't think we're going to be able to achieve those broader demands if we skip over the part of supporting, nurturing workers really beginning to feel their power and their wisdom in understanding what we need to do and what the world could look like. And I think that can lead to things like a Green New Deal that is really supported by workers who understand what that could look like and how to make that happen. I think certainly Medicare for All is something that should be out front. It cracks me up in a sick and sorry way that Joe Biden has doubled down on refusing that. But I actually think we can push beyond that. I think the nationalization of the hospitals is something that I hear nurses talking about. That's really important. And I think in terms of a stimulus package and funding, you know, Bernie was asking for $2,000 a month. I think it should be $3,000 a month per person for the duration of this. It's going to be a pittance compared probably to what Boeing is getting. And then as well, I think we really need to look at how are we putting money into our public institutions. So you're in higher ed, public higher ed. We need a stimulus package for public higher ed that says we will, you know, cancel debt for educators, for students, and for public universities. You know very well, Joe, what it means for UMass Boston to have carry the debt that it does. Make sure no jobs are lost and put the money back into getting people on campus so we can have face-to-face classes. The same for public education. I agree with Doug was saying earlier. We have let's put money into the infrastructure, into transportation, into a Green New Deal. It is, I think those are things people want. I think, as Matt has pointed out, the ruling classes, including most of our senators, whichever side they pretend to be on, are not interested in making the kinds of political commitments that it would mean to do that. And so it's going to be up to us to create the movement that makes that happen. We can't count on them.
Powerfully put, Barbara. I mean, there's been this debate now, right, in the national media, who gets to decide when the economy opens again, right? Trump and some of his supporters saying before the end of April or May 1st, and then governors saying, no, we have the right, right? There, you could see in the context of that division amongst the ruling class, the possibility that workers could assert themselves and say, actually, you know what? We get to decide, right?
And
now,
there's actually a growing movement among educators to say, we'll decide when we go back, and
right.
we'll decide what it looks like.
Great. I mean, I think that's a powerful point you make about needing to root whatever demands people are going to come up with, rooting them in actual workplace power. Otherwise, we're just talking to, bought off politicians too often. Okay, or out of touch and bought off. Doug, I'd love to hear from you, and then Matt, some, if I could say concrete, maybe they're abstract as well, I don't know, but like concise kind of demands, or at least opportunities that you see in this moment, things that you think people should be considering taking up as demands, whether it's on politicians or workplaces, for how we can seize the transformative potential of this moment when the economy is so obviously a matter of politics.
To the examples that Barbara made of the workers organizing, I think it's been inspiring to see like Amazon workers, the Instacart workers, the Whole Food workers, people who really have had nothing like union organization at all, taking matters into their own hands and trying to get them sick benefits and protective equipment and decent treatment from their trillionaire bosses. So that explosion of activism among a group of workers that hadn't seen that before, and that's an interesting development. It would be really nice if the organized labor movement actually got involved itself and got off its rather sorry ass and did something. Another point I want to make too is that this moment is really making visible that workers produce value. We've heard so much the last few decades about its intangibles, or managers, or the creative class, and all these apps. The lighter than air economy that was very popular late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of that ideology came back again. No, workers acting on nature, produce everything of economic value. And I think this moment is making it very clear. And the eagerness of so many employers to get workers back to work really shows how dependent upon ordinary workers their wealth is. So it's just a very clarifying moment to see that. But when I talk about a Green New Deal, I mean both parts of that. The green part, obviously, the renewable energy, non-destructive forms of transportation, different ways of organizing the way we live physically. I mean, we can't have this kind of sprawl. Like, there's just so many inefficiencies. There's no much, it doesn't make sense to send goods halfway around the world just to save a few bucks on wages, if there's going to be so much carbon spewed into the atmosphere to make that possible. So, that the green side, yes, but also the New Deal side. Building the conventional infrastructure, but also the redistributive social programs that we saw in the 30s. The 30s saw the introduction of Social Security. Now we have this ridiculously awful minimal welfare state. There's been a brief expansion of unemployment insurance benefits, but they're still quite mean. Only about a third of the unemployed are drawing benefits in normal times. The benefits are quite small. So we need real serious income support for when people get thrown out of work. We need, obviously, Medicare for all has never been so clear. And then just the general public sector is going to be under such tremendous attack now. Cities and states are going to be cutting their budgets savagely because of the loss of revenue. We got to do something to prevent that from happening. The federal government has to mobilize, but we also really have to think not just about money being sent, checks being sent, magic money being pumped into the markets by the Fed. We need to think about the physical reconfiguration of our productive structure, producing different things in different ways under different sets of incentives. So it's not just about money, it's about how we produce and what we produce that we really need to rethink. And when we talk about that New Deal, I'm also thinking about that. My friend Josh Mason co-wrote a paper on the World War II model of how to organize production. We could do that again. We had, the World War II was fought with a great mobilization of the private sector under public direction. And we need that again. We need this Defense Production Act that Trump keeps flirting with. Maybe it's very powerful. We could invoke it, but don't want to all that nonsense he's talked around that. We could do that. We could reorganize production rather quickly to produce ventilators and all the protective equipment we need. And everybody's so slow to do that. We need tests. Antibody tests, coronavirus tests. We're not getting that. It's so slow. We really need that. We need to reconfigure that physical productive structure and the set of incentives that motivate it. It's all about whatever produced for profit, not need. We need to change that around. We need to produce for need, not profit. Even where we locate hospitals is based on what profit, not need. A place like Massachusetts General is just rolling in money, whereas urban hospitals are closing, rural hospitals are closing. But so we need to reorganize the allocation of physical resources as well as just thinking about sending checks around. And I think workers have a very important part, role to play in that. Nurses and teachers are very inspiring occupations. I mean, they really have the reproduction of our society, the protection of the weak, and the reproduction of our society, the nurturing of the young. They should really be have a very prominent role in how we think about restructuring the society after this crisis. And the workers in this case are really an incredible resource, and our leaders have proven to be completely incompetent and foolish and venal. And they need to step aside.
I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep the neighbors upstairs from stomping on your conversation. They have a little one running around all the time. I couldn't agree more about the point about educators and nurses. And I want to gesture towards our conversation next week will in fact include one of the frontline workers in the nurses union, the NYSNA, Trey Kwan, who's also an organizer with Left Voice, and she will be joining us. And we may also have one of the organizers of the University of California strike that's going on out there right now. So educator and nurse organizers serving the people and organizing to strengthen the people will be back on this show next week. Just a little plug there. Matt, we're going to kick it to you. And then I want to recruit one of our guests, I should say one of our audience members, Ron, who's also written on the opportunities of the Defense Production Act and some of this World War II metaphor and an analogy we're hearing thrown around, right? What are the opportunities of kind of taking that rhetoric of we're in a war footing right now and actually politicizing it in a progressive way? So Ron, if I could call on you after Matt. Matt, what do you think? I mean, right now, should be done. What should the bailout have included? What should the next one, if you even want to call it a bailout at all, have included? How does your insight into the corrupt workings of the financial system kind of translate into kind of potential political openings, political demands in this moment, beyond just getting educated about finance?
Yeah, I mean, what Barbara and Doug were saying was I think I want to like draw upon what they were noting, which is that, you know, if you think about workers and you think about inputs and physical capacity, you know, what we're really talking about is production, right? That's what we're talking about. How do we make things and sell things that we need? How should we do that? What does the politics look like? And I think what's exciting about this moment is that, you know, we've been living on consumer politics where we just assume that stuff just shows up in shelves forever, like for my whole life. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got to deal with shortages. We see it's very clarifying. The workers make things, and, you know, people like me who just, you know, I get to study and write. That's not real. I mean, that's just kind of like, you know, I like that I get to do it. And I like that I enjoy, you know, it's enjoyable and interesting. And I want to think it's useful, but, you know, it's not that important right now. But I don't want to talk about what the right thing to do in the bailout is. I want to talk about something that I think is just much more fundamental. We already passed the bailout. We passed it a month ago. And I don't think that it's fair to say, oh, it's just a bunch of venal, corrupt politicians. Oh, it doesn't have to do with workers. Like, I'm sorry, but we're in a democracy. We elected these people. We had major presidential campaign. One of the major candidates, Bernie Sanders, ran basically on massive expansion of public health infrastructure. Another one of the candidates, Elizabeth Warren, ran on cracking down on Wall Street. Both of them made arguments that they were an important social movement. Both of them talked about organizing. Both of them talked about workers. And when push came to shove, they have massive amount. They can raise a lot of money. They can organize a lot of people. They both had what they called social movements. And I got to admit that they had zero policy impact when it mattered. None, zero. Faced with the largest public health crisis in our lifetimes and a massive financial crisis, that the largest one at least since 2008, maybe larger, zero impact. And not only zero impact, but if you actually talk to people who are paying attention to politics now, which is not just politicians, but various supporters, various people who talk about social movements or whatever, they literally do not and cannot internalize what Bernie Sanders did. That Bernie Sanders took his movement, which he started basically because, you know, got popular because of the anger over the bailouts. And the final act that he did with his movement, which he called a movement, was to transfer trillions of dollars to Wall Street. I think that's a catastrophe. I think that's a failure. And I don't just blame abstract politicians. I think that is a failure of the left. And I think no one on the left has admitted it or reckoned with it or tried to figure out what the hell to do and what went wrong. I think it's a catastrophic ideological failure. I think we need to ditch the Green New Deal framing. I think we need to look back and say everything we did failed and just start, you know, look, it's exciting to see workers, you know, striking. But as Doug pointed out, it's not organized labor doing that. There's no institutional reach to those people who are rightfully angry. I don't see any reason to assume that we have anything to offer. And I think that we should really look into what we did wrong and say, well, how did we screw this up so badly? That's why I'm saying, look at corporate power, because I studied corporate power and I noticed there's all this stuff that was going on. And I tried to tell lots of people, hey, this is what's going on. And it just wasn't really any interest in it, because it's like, oh, well, what does that have to do with, you know, the ordinary person? And it's, oh, that's too complicated. But it's like, I'm sorry, but that's trillions of dollars. You can't just pretend that that doesn't matter and that everything has to do with the story of some worker. It's just, that's just not a way, that's not a legitimate way to wield power. It's not a legitimate political movement. It's just a way of doing therapy, personal therapy, and watch as you watch things get worse. And I really think that we have to, either internalize that and deal with it and rethink how we operate, or just resign ourselves to being irrelevant. One of the two.
Yeah, I appreciate that provocation, Matt. I do want to bring in some other voices, but before we move on from your point, I want to say our plan on Shelter in Solidarity is to have a deep dive on summing up the Bernie Sanders campaign, the presidential election, and also looking at what the kind of COVID crisis means for democracy itself in this moment. We hope to have Bill Fletcher actually hosting that.
Let me push you. Let me prod you on something then, because this is the left, okay? So I'm going to push you.
Well, now let me say one thing first, which I would insist on making a distinction. Although I appreciate the provocation, it's a distinction between those who want to settle for just cathartic narrative and those who are actually working at the grassroots level to try to make a real left possible. At least, and certainly
I don't buy that argument, because I don't think that the grassroots left is the only thing that matters. I think I've heard this grassroots organizer.
Who's more important? Pundits in Washington?
I think citizens are more important.
You're the one who's presenting the Bernie Sanders campaign as the example. That's not even what I'm talking about. You're the one who's talking about
elected leaders. You mentioned every single.
I'm talking about workers organizing at the work site to know their real power in order to transform.
They don't have any real power. I'm sorry, they don't have any real power.
Of course they do. That's why the economy's trash.
They don't. No, the economy's trash because they don't have any real power. Look, Doug, you named every single elected official and said every single one of them is crazy and Who do you think they are? Who do you think elects them? People do. Democrats do. Voters do. I'm actually representing normal people. I'm actually talking about what most people think. You guys are making up a fantasy world in which, like, we're all just victims. No, we're not. I'm sorry, but we picked this.
Nobody said that.
I'm going to jump in there, Matt.
I think misconstruing the conversation.
Look, this is the problem here.
Matt, can you listen as well as speak? I just want to. I think you're being heard here, and I do appreciate. I don't speak for others. I appreciate the provocation because I do see the tendency you're talking about. But I do, from my standpoint, as a member of a labor movement, as an educator, as an activist, as a communicator, as a member of, I see tensions and struggles between the tendency you're talking about and other tendencies. Now, I'm just going to ask you to take on faith that they exist. Now, maybe they don't have enough power to show up on your radar right now, and that is a problem. But I just don't think it's fair to assume, without really knowing the people that are here, that they are just to be lumped in with the liberal right-left, right? These, and now one of my problems, I think, one of my concerns is that the people who do see.
I value politics. Okay. I value it. I think that discussions of politics, I think that discussions in Congress matter. I think that discussions among elected officials matter. Those people get elected to represent people. I think that those votes matter. And I don't believe that if there's just, and your point about strikes, and I think it's really exciting to see lots of strikes. I think it's really exciting to see workers discovering their own power over workplaces. But I think it's a real mistake to discount political discourse just because people weren't talking about the things that you care about. That matters. The conversations among elected officials matters.
Absolutely.
We do not live in a dictatorship. We elect these people. So if these people are talking about things in a way that's destructive or catastrophic, which I think that they are, we voted for them. We chose them. That's on us too. And we have to acknowledge that.
Some of us did, and it's true. I think, I'm going to just be very brief, and then I'm going to pitch it. I'm going to bring Ron into the conversation, and I'd love to hear Doug and Barbara's and others' response to this, but also, on other issues. I think one of the dangers is there are plenty of people I see on social media right now who call themselves on the left, radical left or whatever, who are denouncing Bernie Sanders for his, for endorsing Joe Biden or for the bailout vote. But too often I find that resistance to, the liberal turn in the Sanders camp takes what we might call inadequately political form, right? It takes an almost rejection of electoral politics per se, right? It's just like kind of baby with the bathwater, rather than finding struggling with the tougher question, which is how do we actually bring a real left analysis and real left politics into a political form that can fight inside the system as well as outside it. To me, that's where I'm coming from. And I don't see enough of that.
I'm not persuaded that that the left is the right way to do this. I don't see a seriousness.
So what is the right
left.
way? I mean, what are you recommending? I see a lot of denunciation, but I don't hear any
I don't have an
constructive
answer
suggestions.
I don't have an answer for you, but I think that what we're seeing right now, and this is particularly nasty with China, where,
Matt, before we bring in China, can we go to Ron? Ron's been very patient, and one of the the promises of our show is that we get 15 minutes for live audience to participate, and our guests can also listen and respond. Okay, Ron, let's go to you.
Well,
Ron Hydock, everybody. Yeah.
And I hope that we can get to some of the other folks that are on and have them weigh in, because I think this is a really robust and important conversation. To sort of follow from Matt's initial quoting someone from history, Lenin once put it, what is to be done? So I don't think it's either or, right? That's sort of my punchline. I don't think that the electoral route, I think you ignore elections at your own risk. Look what we got. We got Trump as a good example. I think that to the extent that the movements and the workers' movement in particular, and growing consciousness of it, I can allude to another great couple of works, Marx's class struggles in France and the 18th Brumaire, really grapple with this sort of, the uprisings, the class conflict, and tearing away the veil, as Marx would talk about, the bourgeois democracy, right? And yet, here we are with people who are thrown out of work, right? And in dire consequences in terms of health. And increasingly, this crisis is going to really demand solutions. And I want to use the multiple, because I think we can't just criticize without organizing and being really strategic. There's lots of the piece that I wrote that's up on, that we have to organize now like our lives depend on it, because guess what? For so many people, that's really what we're talking about. And sort of tie it back to some of the business around Bernie, right? So to the extent that Bernie's campaign and his apparatus, I don't think that's all said and done. I mean, Daniel Denver wrote a piece in Jacobin calling on the Bernie folks to retool that campaign in ways that really can be an organizing force. I mean, 2 million donors, right? Tens of thousands of volunteers that knocked on millions of doors. And they have actual paid staff still. And there's other organizations that are that potentially can help provide the infrastructure to a response that's really leftish. And I think we have to demand more, of course, of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and all the rest. I mean, I'm here in San Francisco and talking to some folks about, Nancy Pelosi's, one of her offices is here, and we should go do something. How do you do this now in the shelter in place moment?
Yeah.
And I think that there's so many things that I want to jump into in terms of how you do the organizing. I wish my colleague Anthony Pankey was here with us today, because he's been working with a lot of farm worker organizations around the country. That's one of his areas, is farm worker organizing. And the needs there are tremendously acute, and the capacity of farm workers who are seeing now their power, but also the bankruptcy in the system, right? I mean, farmers are told to dump their milk, plow under their crops, right? And yet there's like a mile-long line of people at a food bank. Those conditions are just going to get worse. People have been told that they're going to get a $1,200 check. It's inadequate, but when they don't show up or when that money runs out, we're talking about social dislocation on a scale we've not seen in our lifetimes. And to the extent that Bernie's campaign has helped elevate, Medicare for all, $15 an hour, abolish student debt, the Green New Deal, like all tax the rich, all of these things are much more popular now than they had been before, precisely because of Bernie's campaign. And so I would just argue for looking to the the excitement and the organizations that rallied around those campaigns as entities that could form an infrastructure for fighting in ways that, yes, try to get those elected officials to be more responsive. They're talking about a next package. What's that going to look like? Maybe we can impress upon them the fierce urgency of now, if I can use that phrase, that demands that they actually leverage their capacity to negotiate that, because the House has the power of the right?
Ron, just pause.
To make sure. Oh,
you cut out, but we got you. I want to point, Ron has some really tremendous ideas here. I want to point everyone who's on this call and who's listening or watching to his piece at the new blog of Socialism and Democracy. That's sdblog.org. He very provocatively titled the piece, well, along the lines of how the virus can actually be an ally, right? That the kind of leverage of the threat the virus poses, even to wealthier ruling class folks, can actually be an ally in asserting kind of working class demands in a way that we could use strategically. And so I just want to point people to that piece, and we will link it from our website and from our Facebook page. Now, the last back and forth with Matt, kind of left out Doug and Barbara a little bit. I would like to welcome them back into this, not only to respond to Matt's point, but maybe looking forward, like, where do you see the possibility of building power? How do we get such a corrupt political class to listen? Do you see it as just a failure of everyday people, or is there a problem with what counts as democracy even in our, in our society right now that kind of mediates and makes mincemeat of people's actual demands? How do you respond to this this question of how we can really build power in this moment? And take it anywhere you want if you want to respond to other things that have been said.
Who?
Let's go to Doug and then Barbara.
Okay, I would like to say a couple of things. One is that the idea that we elect these people is a really rather limited understanding of how power works in this country. I think we know that people in Congress, elected officials, pay most attention to the business class. The work of Benjamin Page and his colleagues show that on most major legislation of the last few decades, the preferences of the top 1% matter, and the opinions of the rest of the electorate don't matter at all. But also that 40 or so years of neoliberalism has so successfully dampened down people's expectations for politics, for collective action, for what they can expect from the public sector, what they can expect on the job, in the way of salaries and benefits, of worker rights. They just expect nothing. They're almost grateful now to have a job. To see these people like demonstrating in Michigan yesterday, like, let us go back to work. They urge to go back to work rather than like try to figure out how we get through this crisis was kind of dispiriting to watch. And then, the preferences of the Democratic electorate, the primary electorate, with these debased notions of electability, the fear of doing anything to challenge the existing power structure. Bernie did the best he could, but he had an awful lot stacked against him. Watching Obama orchestrate the collective movement behind Biden was really also quite a depressing, but entirely predictable act of a guy who would rather be sailing with David Geffen than thinking about how he can make the lives of the broad population better. Yeah, so we really need to fight that atomization, that sense of defeat that is so abroad among most people, and this willingness to defer to the wishes of the powerful, or fear that challenging it would cause the re-election of Trump. It's the politics right now. It seemed for a moment very hopeful. It seemed like we might break out of all this, but now it's kind of depressing again that the doddering fool Biden is at the top of the ticket. I just there is this moment of possibility where workers are showing some degree of the power or potential power of workers is very, very visible. But that's easily shattered, and it's really hard to organize. So the labor movement should be in there actually doing more than it is. But people need some sense of that they have power to make things better.
Yes.
And it's very hard for them to develop that sense after being so beat upon for so many years.
And on that, I want to bring Barbara in I know she needs to go in a moment, Barbara. One thing I've always been inspired by you is your ability to help people raise their expectations, right? You talk about raising expectations as a necessary precursor to raising hell, right? That people have been beaten down. Could you pick up, I think, in some sense, Doug's comment really walks into your ballpark here. I mean, how do you address this issue of demoralization and the possibility of raised expectations, even despite the obstacles of this moment?
Yeah, I wanted to go there, so I appreciate the segue, Doug. I mean, I think it goes back to why it matters that that we organize initially in the places that people work and live. That people have an experience of taking collective action, engaging in collective struggle. And time again, in my experience, when workers do that, they do discover their power. They discover the possibilities of their power, and they want more. So it matters to have a vision of what's possible in order to engage people, for people to be angry enough about what they could have and don't have. But that only becomes real when workers organize themselves and act collectively to begin to achieve wins. And I think, like, one of the things that makes this moment a moment of real possibility is that prior to the pandemic and prior to the sort of wildcat, rough, disorganized strikes that we see out there right now, is that we've seen public sector workers, in particular educators, have had an incredible run for the last 10 years, beginning with the Chicago Teachers Union and the Core Caucus taking over their strikes of 2012, the UTLA strike just a year ago in January, the organizing in the red states, which was, West Virginia started that off. That West Virginia group is now running for leadership in their union. I am part of a network of caucuses in education unions across the country, some of which have won leadership, like I did here in Massachusetts, some that are pushing their unions. We're at a different moment in terms of that level of power. We're also seeing the nurses unions doing the same. So that's out there. And people are transformed by that kind of action. They're not transformed as much or in the same way, even though canvassing can be great, by the electoral political strategy. That end game is always that the ways that I have power is vote. And you may or may not feel that as part of a collective movement. But when you act together in an immediate way to use your collective power to make change and to have the world to be better in front of you, that changes you. And that helps people begin to understand how power works. And that's what's been missing. Totally agree that the labor movement has failed us for a long time about that. But that's also what won us the New Deal. That's how we got there. That's what pushed the politicians eventually. It takes a faith in actual democracy. It takes a faith in the fact that when people get together and identify issues and organize themselves to say, here's a way we can solve that problem, that they'll do it. And that's like why I used to tell my students when I was my student teacher, when I was a teacher educator, that cynicism is like one of the only sins. If we believe in democracy and we believe in organizing, we believe in the possibility of transformation, we have to have faith that people can do that. And that's our responsibility.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Barbara, and you inspire me. And actually, I mean, one of the goals of Shelter and Solidarity is not only to come up with the answers to these questions and struggles and strategies, though I hope that we can pull some new ideas out of this mix, but also to help sustain each other through this moment, right? And kind of, because I'm a big believer that faith is not just an intellectual aspect, although that's a part of it, right? The objective notion that things could be different, right? But there's a social component, right? You need other people to help lift up that horizon as well. And I will say this conversation for me has been very provocative, thought-provoking, but also to see all your faces from quarantine is helpful too. I want to point out that Matt, if you want to come back and dig into more the problems with the left and how we can work through, if the left's even going to be the name of it after the end of this change, I'd love to have you back. Same thing to Doug, and definitely I've already extended that invitation to Barbara to come back. And we're going to talk about educational workers organizing, students and educational communities organizing in this moment, even as people are having to teach from home. So we will be coming back next Thursday with a show focused on nurses' struggles, perhaps educator struggles as well. We'll be doing a show on what's the threats to democracy, even in its bourgeois electoral form in this moment, with Bill Fletcher in a couple weeks. Tim Sheard, a lifelong nurse and labor organizer, will be helping to host our show next week. And we'll be here again, 5 o'clock on Thursday. We ask you to join us. Share this material, send us your feedback. You can email me at joe@shelterandsolidarity.org. If you have any suggestions, obviously this is a long haul we're in together, and thank you for being here tonight, and see you next time.